Hello, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody joining us for today's Bussola Institute webinar. The subject of today's event is Pursuing Global Health Security After COVID-19, and it follows on from another webinar we held in October entitled Enhancing Health Security Through Multilateral Cooperation. Following our discussion at that event, our panel of experts and academics concluded that greater international cooperation and collaboration will be paramount in ensuring global health security into the future. Today's event will bring that discussion forward another step to examine how the lessons learned at national and regional levels in successfully addressing the pandemic can be translated into future multilateral policies and actions in support of ongoing global health security. To debate this next critical phase in the practical development of a multilateral approach to global health security, we are honoured to have assembled a high-level panel of diplomatic representatives and experts based in Europe and the Gulf. They will explore how the development of good practices in both regions throughout the course of the health crisis can now assist in building effective leadership for global cooperation and multilateral action to ensure better preparedness for the next pandemic. At the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow last week, it was noted that the stress of the pandemic has reinforced nation-first mentalities, deepened inequalities, and weakened the multilateral system. But there is now also a greater appreciation of the necessity for strong regional and inter-regional cooperation and the value of shared, indisputable scientific research and evidence in addressing the fundamental global challenges of our age. The EU and Gulf countries have strong track records in regional and inter-regional cooperation and have been among the world leaders on effective pandemic responses and vaccine rollouts. Drawing on the lessons learned at national and regional levels in successfully addressing the pandemic, both regions working together have the potential to lead the international community in the practical development of multilateral approaches to support future pandemic readiness and global health security. And before I introduce our first guest today, I just wish to acknowledge that all of our distinguished panelists come to us with a very wide range of experience and expertise. Each of them has a very extensive curriculum vitae, so I'm only proposing to highlight a few of their very many achievements as I introduce each one in turn. Now, for the audience who have just joined us, you will probably notice that His Excellency Ambassador Dr. Khaled Al-Jindan from the Embassy of Saudi Arabia in Brussels isn't with us at the moment. There appears to be some slight technical hitch, but hopefully we'll get it sorted. I had intended starting with Dr. Khaled, but I will start with our next guest, who is Barry Andrews. Barry is a member of the European Parliament and is a very experienced and highly regarded Irish politician. Prior to his election to the European Parliament, Barry served as Director General of the Institute of International and European Affairs, Ireland's leading think tank on European policy. Before that, Barry was CEO of GOAL, Ireland's principal humanitarian agency. He also served as Minister for Children and Youth Affairs in the Irish government. Barry, it's great to see you today, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'll begin with a question that I suppose it depends on the perspective you're coming from, and it has to do really with vaccine equity. And just maybe from what has been going on in the background, health leaders across the world agree that a world without COVID-19 will not be possible until everyone has equal access to vaccines. Developed countries are far more likely to vaccinate, which risks prolonging the pandemic and widening global inequality. And in the whole context of our discussion today about multilateralism, the Director General of the World Health Organization recently said that vaccine equity was not rocket science nor charity, it is smart public health and in everyone's best interest. Could you give me your view on that, Barry, please?
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation, John. And as Dr. Tedros has said, the model of donor-recipient charity, essentially, in respect of vaccine distribution, clearly isn't working. And that is really unfortunate. As you say, it really does contribute to a growing economic inequality, John. And I heard evidence this morning from Melinda Gates in European Parliament committee, where she noted, and I think it's well noted, that more than 40 million people have fallen back into poverty since COVID-19. And this is only going to get worse. It's going to get worse in an exponential way. And I was involved in the Ebola outbreak. I was the head of GOAL at that time. And the key lesson from that time was health system strengthening. The one major takeaway from Ebola is that we needed to strengthen the health systems in developing countries. And the framework for that at a global level is through the World Health Organization and the international health regulations. And unfortunately, this is a completely ineffective way to bring about preparedness for pandemics, or indeed to deal with the question of the production, the procurement and distribution of vaccines. So what is needed is to harness what's there at the multilateral level in the World Health Organization, but also what's there in the private sector. So for example, Gavi, CEPI, the Gates Foundation, and the work that they're doing on the distribution of vaccines, and to create a global pandemic treaty. And I believe that is the only way that we can ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of this current epidemic. And I'll just say one thing about what could happen next. You could have an illness like Ebola, which is a hemorrhagic fever, that is as dangerous as Ebola, where more than 30% of those who contracted it died, but as transmissible as COVID, which is not as deadly as Ebola. But if you had an airborne viral hemorrhagic fever that became an epidemic, we would really have to sit up straight. And what we have to do now is prepare for that possible eventuality. And that means having a global system of distribution, but also a global governance system that builds on what's there with the World Health Organization, particularly around the international health regulations, the way in which outbreaks are notified to the global community, which itself was a major deficit in how we got to know about COVID-19 in the early weeks of the spread of the infection. So I'll just make those comments by way of introduction, John, and look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Barry. And I'll come back to you again, and maybe we'll have a chat about COVAX and, various other issues, and move on to a little bit more to multilateralism. Mary, I'll take you next with Mary Whelan. Has had a very distinguished career in Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs, and has been a key member of Ireland's diplomatic team in many countries and in many roles. She has served, for example, as Irish ambassador to the Netherlands and to Austria. And from 2001 to 2006, Mary served as permanent representative to the United Nations and other international organizations based in Geneva, including the World Health Organization. While in this role, Mary chaired the important World Health Organization working group that drafted the international health regulations, which now form the legal basis for international cooperation on infectious diseases. Mary was a panelist during our previous webinar on this topic, and clearly from the hugely positive reaction to her valuable comments on that occasion, Mary has much more to contribute. Mary, I'm delighted that you've agreed to join us today. Mary, during our previous webinar, you commented that you were disappointed as to how the world responded to the pandemic, yet not surprised. Are you hopeful that states and governments have learned from the current pandemic and that better preparedness will result?
Well, that's a difficult question. And the answer is yes and no. If we have a very similar disease in the next 5, 10, 15 years, then I would be very confident that the world will have learned the lessons and know how to respond. And I say that because, in a sense, the world has learned the lessons from the economic crisis of 2008 and how we responded on the economic side internationally to COVID was so much better than what happened over 10 years ago. So in that sense, yes, but where I am concerned would be the fact that there are so many urgent things, and urgent pushes out important. We all know that. So governments are concerned with the climate challenge, governments are concerned with their economies, governments are concerned with international health, and gradually certain things fall down the agenda, and that makes me somewhat concerned. But it also makes me think that we must build much more resilient systems so they're less dependent on constant political engagement, resilient systems at the national and at the international level, and resilient societies. I also think that there is always the danger, I think it was Churchill who used the phrase, generals fight the last war. And there's the danger that the next time something comes up, and I think Barry referenced, for example, something along the lines of an Ebola pandemic, we can't just take the COVID-19 pandemic off the shelf and think that that's how we're going to combat a very different type of disease. So I think our focus has to be hopeful, to justify our hope. The focus has to be on building good systems, resilient societies, and adaptive societies.
Thank you very much, Mary. Just wanted to check, Dr. Khaled, are you with us at all? No, I got a message that he was, but not yet, obviously. Thanks a lot, Mary. I'll be coming back to you again, and we'll develop a little more on that. But thank you so much for that answer. And it really does develop what you had been saying the last day. I move on now to His Excellency Jasmine bin Mohammed Al Bodawi. Jasmine is the current ambassador of the state of Kuwait to the Kingdom of Belgium. He's also a non-resident ambassador to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. In addition, he is head of mission to the European Union and to NATO. He is a hugely experienced diplomat and completed his studies at the University of Oxford in the UK and the University of Utah in the USA. You are most welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And I see Dr. Khaled has just joined us as well. You're very welcome.
Thank you. I hope I have not missed anything.
No, we moved ahead, but we'll come back to you, and I'll give you the opportunity when we've dealt with this issue. Now I'll come back to you in next, and we'll begin our discussion. So okay. Maybe Ambassador, to begin with, as a follow-on to my question, that some of my questions already, I just want to get a little bit of maybe information from you on how Kuwait handled the pandemic, because it's interesting for us when we have two very distinguished and prominent ambassadors here, yourself and Dr. Khaled, to learn about your two respective countries and how you actually handled the pandemic. So maybe you might tell us how successful Kuwait's response to COVID-19 has been, and what were the principal strategies used to control the pandemic?
Thank you, John, very much for inviting me to this very important webinar. I want to start by commending Bussola Institute for the excellent work it has done in promoting GCC-EU relations. It's a very important and historic relations, and we are really embarking on a very futuristic cooperation between the GCC and the EU. We all observed Mr. Borrell's statement in the last Foreign Affairs Council, and I think the Bussola Institute is one of the instruments that could bring the two point of view closer to each other in the track of the 1.5 of think tanks. I will give a short statement, if you allow me, putting in consideration the questions was raised by you now and the questions I received. And I will start by saying that there are several indicators that prove that the steps and measures taken by the state of Kuwait to combat and face the coronavirus pandemic are successful and have borne fruit. They are as follows. Number one, an infection rate of less than 0.2%. Number two, an average daily death are below 1. Number three, vaccination rate with 2 doses is more than 80% for all people that are eligible. Number four, the WHO has expressed its praise and admiration to the measures taken by Kuwait. Number five, the EU has permitted non-essential travelers from Kuwait to enter the Schengen area. Number six, Kuwait is rapidly approaching a complete return to normalcy and its fifth and final phase of combating COVID. To this extent, I would like to explain to you what measures were taken in order to achieve these results. They are as follows. Number one, the Ministry of Health in Kuwait took necessary and creative measures in order to provide the medical staff with the essential equipment to deal with those infected with COVID. Number two, the intergovernmental agencies took advanced steps in order to establishing tracking programs. Number three, in order to protect the public, a well-organized medical monitoring system was established at the borders in Kuwait during the massive evacuation operation. Number four, Kuwait was one of the first countries that was able to secure vaccines and began vaccinating the population on December 2020. The vaccine was optional and free to all citizens and residents of Kuwait. Number five, Kuwait ensured that food security in the country was not affected by the pandemic. Having presented and summarized the measures taken by Kuwait, I would like to highlight Kuwait's position on how to face these outbreaks and any similar future global challenges. Number one, it must be a collective effort by the international community. Number two, countries that have the means, resources, and know-how must help the countries that are in need. Number three, the international community must work together through mechanism or a convention to guide us all when combating any future pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, on cooperation with the international community, Kuwait continues to support international efforts to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. Its total contributions amounted to $327.4 million US, the latest of which was providing $40 million to the Gavi Alliance and the COVID Facility Initiative in an effort to enhance and fortify global health security. As a result of the unprecedented challenges we faced during the COVID pandemic and will be facing similar upheaval and in the foreseeable future, we are determined to strengthen our cooperation with friendly countries to enhance the 5 main pillars of our non-regional foreign policy. Number one, strengthening and developing the global health system. Number two, providing global food security. Number three, development of the global educational system. Number four, collaboration to develop IT systems and artificial intelligence. Number 5, cooperation in the field of cybersecurity. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to highlight an observation that the international community needs to deal with as soon as possible, and the lesson learned from this pandemic about the nature of humanity. First, the observation that the international community needs to deal with is the major problem underdeveloped countries are facing securing vaccine for their nationals, which unfortunately has attained a crisis levels. The vaccination rate, for example, in Africa is below 2%. The international community seriously needs to take measures to protect those people in Africa and other places. On a brighter note, the lesson learned from this pandemic is that humanity prevails under any circumstances. We all have witnessed how we stood by each other during the pandemic, and this brings us to one fact. No matter what problem humanity faces, we will always prevail over any challenges. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I will be able to answer any question you have in this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jasmine, and I will come back to you again for sure. And now to the man that we had intended beginning with, His Excellency Dr. Khaled Ibrahim Al-Jindan, who is the current ambassador of the United Kingdom to the Kingdom of Belgium and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Again, he has had a very long career and very successful career as a diplomat with Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and indeed other roles as well. Dr. Khaled was also a member of the Shura Council of Saudi Arabia. He holds a doctorate in political philosophy from Georgetown University in the United States. Dr. Khaled, as we've just heard from Ambassador Jasmine, Gulf states are currently dealing with the pandemic quite successfully in terms of lower infection rates and high vaccination take-up. Could you please share with us Saudi Arabia's experiences, successful policies, and measures that have enabled your country to successfully control the disease so far?
Well, thank you so much, John, and good morning, everybody. Grateful, and I feel to be a part of this important event. I have high view of Bussola and its contribution to, as my colleague from Ambassador Jasmine has just said, about Bussola and the role it plays in strengthening relations between Gulf states and the EU. I'm glad that Jasmine has preceded me in speaking, because it spared me the efforts of going over many of the numerical details that he touched upon, and the kind of efforts that was spent by Kuwait, because very much, we also have done more or less the same thing, so I'm not going to bother you again with the specifics of the efforts that Saudi Arabia have conducted, in the way of combating, this pandemic, of course, but I'll only touch upon the salient measures, that my government has undertaken from the very start. The first case that came to us, that we knew about, it was back in early March 2020, when the first Saudi national crossed the causeway coming from Bahrain. I think he came originally from Iran through Bahrain and then to Saudi Arabia. That was the very first case, and that, of course, gave us the the cause to move swiftly and effectively, knowing, the consequences only of the spread of this pandemic. My government really acted very, very quickly in this regard, knowing, that the ease with which this kind of pandemic could spread around. So effective and strict measures were taken, I mean, as far as social distancing is concerned, and sterilization and mask wearing and everything, and alerting everybody in the country about the serious consequences of this kind of disease. There was indeed full mobilization of many government departments, all concerned, I mean, with combating this. The Ministry of Health, or the Ministry of Education, the Finance Ministry, the Ministry of Hajj al Umrah, since of course we host the holy places, and you can imagine the huge number of people coming from outside to Saudi Arabia, with the consequences of spreading this kind of disease. But we start, of course, with our citizens, and the starting point was transparency about this. The Ministry of Health appointed a spokesman who spoke every day, telling everybody the situation of the infection, the number of infected people, the hospitalization, and the critical condition, and those who have recovered. Every day after the official news, we hear a lot, about the situation. Of course, many measures and also decisions were made, I mean, as regard limiting public and social occasions of all kinds. And this is as far as combating the thing is concerned. Of course, the number which started in early March, quickly it reached the number of 562 by late March 23, and then 10,000 in April, and then it got to 100,000 in June of last year, of course. So it kept on the so much so, I mean, that there were times, I mean, when my government had to take very strict measures, to the point of instituting even lockdown in some cases, and isolating the cities. And then this is as far as combating and containing, I mean, this wave of disease. The hospitals, of course, were all equipped with the latest medical equipment, I mean, to take care of all infected people. And also, this continued, of course, until at a time when we also chanced to be presiding over the country. And there is a staunch belief in us, I mean, that this kind of pandemic, I mean, never be dealt with except with the international cooperation, international action, I mean, in order to put an end to it and to start the recovery process. So we took the opportunity, I mean, to call for, took the opportunity of our presidency of this very important gathering to call upon the leaders of the G20 to meet last year in March, and important decisions were taken, of course, in order to enhance and encourage international cooperation to confront, I mean, this problem. There was the other side of the story, of course, the economic problem, and my government also tried its best to reach a kind of balance, I mean, between combating, I mean, treating with this health problem, and at the same time also maintaining some kind of normalcy in the economic process. So also, when the G20 met, they had these two aspects in mind. And then, so important resolutions, decisions were taken. Then $500 million were devoted, I mean, in order to, for the medical and health purpose, I mean, of the story. The other side also, we knew all those who met, I mean, G20 knew, of course, about the kind of gaps that exist between advanced and rich countries and the least and less developed ones, I mean, who also need all the help they can get this problem. So 300 million would also to help the least developed, those who need the help. I mean, especially as Jasmine said, in the African countries. So we also, we had in mind, I mean, that without international cooperation, there is no way, I mean, we can deal with this problem. Now, of course, by the end of last year, of course, vaccinations was started. And this, of course, paved the way for kind of a recovery and the beginning of relaxation. So we spared no time, I mean, to move quickly, I mean, to get the people vaccinated. And there was, of course, as this vaccination process was also optional, but we had in mind, I mean, all the people getting vaccinated, the problem will continue. Now, I mean, the number I have, I mean, for those, we have, I think, around 80% of the population who have at least the first vaccine, the first dose. And with the number of those who had the two of them, I think it amounts to around 60% of the population. So with vaccination, you know, spreading around, I think there was a start of going back to normalcy, especially with that my government also acted in order to avoid any kind of problem in the economy. I mean, so they gave a lot of all kinds of stimulations. I mean, for to see, I mean, that there will be no serious problems with the last year also. I must say, I mean, it was not only we called not only for an extraordinary session. Of course, when the regular conference of the G20 met late in November last year, they took up from when they left, where they left the extraordinary session, and also elaborated on the resolutions, I mean, to enhance international response, I mean, to cope with the crisis.
Yes.
But the thing also went beyond that. There was a call for the energy ministers to lead.
To get involved as well. Dr. Khaled, that's wonderful. You've actually painted a wonderful picture of what you've been doing in Saudi Arabia, your links to the international organizations, the development that began with the G20 meeting in Riyadh and that moved on to what the G20 indeed has been doing since. So if I could maybe move round, and then I'll come back to you again in a few minutes, if that's okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much. You've given us an extraordinarily clear and detailed picture, which is wonderful. Barry, if I can come back to you for a minute to take up some of what Dr. Khaled and indeed Ambassador Jasmine has said to do with the collective approach, multilateral, people working together. I think we all know that the pandemic, at least initially, reinforced nation-first mentalities. Hard to blame people. Maybe it reduced trust, deepened inequalities, and weakened the multilateral system. Do you think that, from your perspective, looking at it as an MEP, for example, do you think that the EU's experience of dealing with its member states throughout the pandemic will be useful in responding to these challenges in the future?
Yes, I do, John. I think the regional approach of the European Union has been actually quite successful. If you just take the European Union by itself and ignore our other global obligations, because we developed a vaccine very quickly, ready for distribution across the member states. The European Investment Bank would have invested in the early stages of, for example, what BioNTech were eventually produced with Pfizer. And we also developed the distribution model, which is very equitable across the member states. And we developed a digital COVID certificate, which has allowed a degree of access to public buildings and tourism to recommend. So at a regional level, everything, in my opinion, was quite good. But the fault here goes beyond merely health multilateralism. And bear in mind, the European Union had very limited competences in the health area, but still managed to achieve quite a lot at that regional level. But there are so many problems for multilateralism. Isn't just the WHO, but the World Trade Organization as a multilateral institution has been completely undermined. And the Ministerial Council coming up later this month is unlikely to achieve anything. The United Nations Security Council has been ineffective for a long time. There are other multilateral institutions that are really struggling at the moment, as the rule of law is under attack, and not just outside the European Union, but even inside the European Union. So, we have an opportunity to get the health multilateral system right. And I totally agree with Dr. Tedros's view that it shouldn't be about all people in some countries having access to the vaccine, but rather some people in all countries, particularly healthcare workers, those who are immunocompromised, and the elderly. But that hasn't been the case, and it is completely undermined the whole principle of multilateralism. So we really have to get on top of that. The COVAX model is a good model in theory, but the European Union member states pre-booked vaccines outside the COVAX system. Mm-hmm. So it has a limited effectiveness, and it isn't a good demonstration to the global south, for example, that we are inclined to multilateralism when in an emergency. But COVAX is a good model in theory, and it should help us as a roadmap for future vaccination campaigns. And as we know, all of the measles and polio and other vaccination campaigns ground to a halt across the globe. So we can learn something from COVAX, but as I said at the beginning, I think a pandemic treaty is absolutely required. And I think we have to really have a coalition of the willing, more of a plurilateral global pandemic health treaty that deals with these major issues.
Great, Barry, thanks. And I'm glad you dealt with the COVAX issue as well, because that covered another question. Mary, if I could come to you briefly, and just to follow on from, this whole multilateralism, people working together, countries working together. In June of this year, just a few months ago, you wrote a very interesting paper entitled International Health Diplomacy, followed by a question mark. In your view, why do we need global health diplomacy now, and how can countries benefit from it?
Let me explain the question mark first of all, because I think that's what you're asking.
Yes, it is.
We're hearing a lot of talk about health diplomacy as if it was different from anything else.
Right.
And foreign policy and international cooperation is based on the premise that for countries to achieve their objectives, they have to work together to further their national objectives through other people as well. And in the context of health diplomacy, rather than focusing on, is this a nice thing, a new thing? It's not a new thing. It's there since the mid-19th century in forms that we would recognize today. But what we need to realize, and really realize at the national level, is that we will not achieve our own health objectives, that is securing ourselves from pandemics, let us say, without international cooperation. It is simply not possible. COVID did not start in Ireland. It did not start in the Gulf states. In a sense, we don't know where the next epidemic could start. So we have to work together and we have to build resilient systems. And I think we can do that. But we must realize that it's not something extra. It's not something we do for charitable or ethical reasons, although we should do it for those reasons. It's something we do because it safeguards we ourselves. So if there are countries who need help and don't get help, that actually has a negative impact on us. And it's time we woke up and realized that. Similarly, I think we need to realize that wherever we are, we can learn from each other. Some countries, and not all of them have been in the West or in Europe, have had better outcomes than others. Why has that been? What can we learn from them? How can we help them? How can we work with them to develop better systems? So I think that this area above all else needs to be focused on the interest we ourselves nationally have in ensuring that there is an effective system there, because without that in cooperation, there won't be any system.
Great, Mary, thank you so much. And I'm moving on from that to Ambassador Jasmine now. And in the same theme, you mentioned it indeed yourself when you spoke earlier, the whole area of multilateralism, of people working together, collectively sharing information and so on. Now, going forward, first of all, I'll take a quote from your Prime Minister, if I may, who recently said that global recovery will require investment in data and information infrastructure. And our previous seminar emphasized the importance of information sharing for health security. Say, going forward now, how will Kuwait be engaging with multilateral organizations and initiatives in addressing global health security?
Well, John, I think I totally associate myself with what Mary said about the need for multiple efforts, international multiple efforts. There is a call by President Charles Michel of the European Council on an international convention to deal with similar pandemics. And I want, because it's a phenomena, and I want to tie that with a personal experience that I've lived for almost 3 years of my life working on an international convention that dealt with transnational crimes, which when I was a diplomat in Vienna, dealing with it for 3 years, the whole international community dealt with this convention. We all agreed on a text. Then we all went to Palermo, Italy. We all signed it. We need similar effort that deals with health. When it was a phenomena, the transnational crime back then, the international community stood together and came up with a convention. This is exactly what we need, but we need it now to tackle this new. You said it right. You don't know where, when it will hit again. So we better be better prepared for it. And it's a convention, full convention that deals with assistance, that deal with accountability, who's responsible and who's not responsible for such thing, that deals with measures to make sure that those who are not protected and underdeveloped can have the same access for all sorts of issues. Also, this convention could also deal with the quote you mentioned from our Prime Minister about sharing the data and sharing information. It's all about that. How far do you want to go with sharing the data and the information if you don't want to give me the recipe to make the vaccination? I'm a poor country, but I can get the recipe from you and maybe be able to help myself. How do we mix then between the private sector, who rightly, and we don't prevent them from their right to make money and to protect their establishment, but when does humanity prevail? When do we, okay, say you've made enough money, let's move on to providing this help to the other company. It is a collective effort. It is a serious measure, and we've seen COP26. Hopefully, we can see something this magnitude to face this pandemic or any other futuristic pandemic.
Great. And Dr. Khaled, I will have a final question in a few minutes, because we do finish on the hour for everybody, including you also. But maybe to begin with, Dr. Khaled, you are very actively involved. You mentioned the holy site of Mecca. You mentioned visitors to Umrah and the Hajj, and the fact that you're dealing with people from all over the world all of the time. In the context of COVID, and very briefly, what specific plans does Saudi have to continue multilateral engagement and initiatives to address global health generally?
Well, of course, I already made mention of.
You did indeed.
Of my government's deep feeling about the need to act collectively and internationally for this to cope. I mean, with this crisis, and to combat it and to get back quickly to the to state of normalcy. As far as Hajj and Umrah rituals are concerned, of course, we realize, I mean, the possible consequences of continue things as before, I mean, in the presence of this very serious and dangerous pandemic. So my government realizes fully and acted quickly about it. Thankfully, I mean, the response was positive from the Muslim world, I mean, because they knew, I mean, that about the kind of care that Saudi Arabia government is spending for the sake of the safety and comfort of the pilgrims. So when we decided to closure, I mean, of the mosques in Medina and Mecca, I mean, they understood, I mean, the incentives or the intention behind that. So we had no problem about it. So we had already 2 Hajj seasons. The first one was 2020, of course. And then the crisis was at the climax, I mean. And so we had, we had really to do strict limitation as far as the number of the people taking part in Hajj. I think the number was first, I mean, they decided only the Hajj from Saudi, inside Saudi Arabia, are eligible to make this Hajj. This is also to contribute to the limitation of the number. It didn't go beyond 10,000. And you remember, I mean, in normal times, I mean, the number reaches to 2 million at times, or more also. The second Hajj season this year, I mean, we opened up more. I mean, so we had more pilgrims coming to Mecca and visitors to Al-Medina. So as the situation improved, we relaxed restrictions. But again, I think back to the point, I mean, when my government in the context of G20 called for an extraordinary summit, it did this, I mean, from the standpoint or the feeling that, okay, yes, international cooperation is a must, it's not a choice. I mean,
sure.
Collective action is necessary and vital. I mean, to have no choice about that. I'm
great.
See that, I mean, there is growing awareness about the need to involve the world community to really do something about this. And I believe probably it's time now really to start thinking seriously of making some sort of a convention. I mean, in order to get everybody, get them committed, I mean, really to take actions and to move in the direction of global cooperation.
Brilliant. That is great. And in that context, I wish we could stay going. I have so many questions for everybody, and what you've said has raised so many others. I want to finally ask everybody one question, and I'm going to ask each one of you, as we've only about 5 minutes left, and I want to just do a final closing bit, just to answer it maybe in a minute or less. And this final question is that in your experience, how should national governments stay focused on health security in a manner that is based on multilateral cooperation and not on national self-interest? And it's all right, it's fine. It's almost like the vaccine situation. You know, if you see your neighbors and your friends and people close to you dying and they can't get access to a vaccine, well, then are you rushing to say, send all the vaccines to the global south or whatever? But so it's a difficult tension between, I suppose, multilateral cooperation and national self-interest. So maybe we'll start with you, Barry.
Yes, John, and I think, I think things went well at a European level, and therefore maybe we can help to regional development. I'm thinking of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and strengthening the African Union, so that there is a stronger regional impulse, because it's natural that national governments will seek to protect their own population first. So we need to have a system of global governance that bakes that principle in, so that these urges are in some way controlled by treaty obligations. And I think that is just the reality that we can't avoid. However, I very strongly get the sense that the general public are anxious to demonstrate solidarity. There is a very good campaign run by UNICEF in Dublin, which is get a vaccine, give a vaccine. And I think if you polled people, they would be surprised to find that we're into booster vaccines in the developed world, in circumstances where the first dose hasn't been distributed to many millions of people in the developing world, and people want to see a change.
Thank you, Barry. Mary?
I don't see a tension between national interest and multinational cooperation. In fact, one supports the other, and that's what I've been trying to say. But I do think that we shouldn't just look at vaccines, important as they are, because there are countries which are major producers of vaccines, both in the developed world and the less developed world, which have not responded effectively. So I think complementing the idea of strengthened international cooperation, we must have development of more resilient societies, more resilient and adaptive societies. And I think that's the twin pillar: better work at the national level and stronger cooperation at the international level.
Great, Mary, thanks. And thanks to both of you for being so succinct. Ambassador Jasmine, if you're available, just a one.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. I was just trying here to. I think I totally agree with Barry and Mary really on this. It is a collective effort. You cannot distinguish between national and international. It is the responsibility of everybody. I think international institutions have the same responsibilities as countries do. I would like to see the World Bank being more involved in funding and the IMF also in funding, raising the question of how to support countries or programs that combat such thing. I would like to see the UN and its institutions being more involved. I would like to see the WHO to be more transparent with us. They are doing a good job, but I would like them to update us, to put the whole international community within the picture. You cannot do it alone. You have to do it collectively. You have to start in your home, then you go outside. It's a collective, definitely a collective effort. And that's what we've been calling for from day one.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Khaled, finally, again, in about 1 minute.
Again, I cannot but agree with Mary when she spoke about the need to broaden the scope of international cooperation, not confine it only to vaccines. In the beginning of the crisis, we noticed, there was a rise of a sense of protectionism and nationalism in the worst possible sense, so much so that many commodities and many basic needs, were barred, from moving from one country to another out of a feeling, that this pandemic, has to be resisted in any way that they can possibly do. But fortunately, as we have noticed, that there is a growing feeling, no, if you want to be safe, everybody has to be saved.
Yes.
There is possibility, no way, to think of a full recovery in the world, especially now that we have noticed there is a resurgence of the pandemics all over. There is a reemergence of new waves, where there was one and then we had two, we had three, now we're talking about fourth wave. This should be a reason enough for everybody to believe, that no state can do it alone.
Sure.
In order to feel really secure, they have to, move in line with other states, for the same and common purpose. Of course, as Jasmine said, we have to involve international organizations, the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, and I believe in the last G20 meeting, both in Riyadh and in Rome, they also had cognizance of this need. They think they told them they have to really do their share of the job. In this business. So
thank you so much, and thanks to all of you. I wish we could keep going because there's another webinar or 10 more in this if we had the time. And I just want to thank each one of you today for bringing your considerable experience and expertise to this important webinar, and for sharing your insights into an issue that affects not only every society, but all of us, each one of us personally, whether it's from the perspective of public health policy, health systems innovation, health diplomacy, global governments and security, or a wide range of issues. There's a growing consensus that the global community must respond to the necessity for greater multilateral cooperation in the health field. And it is crystal clear, I would say, from our discussion today, that we all agree that, as we say, the virus knows no boundaries, and that unless nations work together in solidarity to help developing countries improve their fragile health systems, world health security cannot be ensured. Finally, I want to thank all of our guests who attended today's webinar. And as always, I'm hugely grateful to all of my colleagues at Bussola for their great support and commitment. Many, many thanks again to everybody. Thank you very much and see you soon. Thanks a lot.